Hi, my name's Chris. I'm from New Zealand. I'm 39 years old. I have an English wife, a Portuguese son named Vasco, after the Gama, of course. I've lived here 6 years. I have a commercial property company across the country, and my wife and I own a company called Paco Services. And recently I've written a book called Meet the Tugas about traveling and discovering the history in the country. And I'm the latest guest of A Simple Life.
Welcome back, or welcome to another episode of Portugal, The Simple Life. And I'm delighted to be joined here by Chris Jones. Chris, thank you for being on the podcast. Boa tarde.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Dylan.
How are you today?
Great, hot, sweaty.
It's hot.
It's 32 degrees where I am, yes.
Yeah, 30 where I am. So we're in the same boat there. And it was a bit of a rough April in terms of the rain, but we're back to normal by the looks of things.
Historically the roughest. And it was Spain as well.
Yeah, everywhere.
It was terrible. And the city, you're in Caldas de Rainha?
Yeah, to the north, yeah. I'm in the southern coast.
Well, Lisbon, when it floods, it floods.
Yeah, it's not a nice town when it rains.
No, it's not. But, the city needs a wash, and now it's beautiful in the sun, so it's all good.
Awesome. Chris, why don't you start off telling us a little bit about you?
Sure. Obviously, my name's Chris. I'm 39. I'm from New Zealand. My wife is English. We have a son named Vasco, after Da Gama.
Oh, cool.
Because I'm a history nerd. My wife isn't, but I convinced her that Vasco was a great name, and it is.
It is a good name, yeah.
It is a good name. It is a good name. I have a commercial property investment company here. I invest in stores and offices in Porto, Lisbon, the Algarve.
Okay.
And my wife and I have a company called Paco Services, and we're a team of 20, and we help everyone, but our principal clientele is foreigners living in the country, and we help them with their personal and business lives on an ongoing basis.
Okay, cool. So that's just like logistical stuff.
Logistical stuff. It's personal assistance on demand, and so it could be anything. It really could be anything. People integrate us into their workflows, their business workflows, if they so wish. But otherwise, it's just ongoing personal support, it's interaction with the Portuguese government, Portuguese authorities, and then day-to-day personal assistance stuff.
Okay, awesome. So, it's also like how people find, if I need a place to take my dog for an operation.
Yes,
or
that is definitely
random stuff.
Yes, there is definitely a lot of random stuff, and that is definitely an example.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things, once you have it, you can sort of open up your world a little bit more. And I think, you wouldn't recognize that people in this country have such exciting lives, I find. There's a richness to life here, and we help with that.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, because I think, as you know, I'm also in real estate, and my clients are from all over the world. And I think sometimes the biggest challenge is kind of replacing those day-to-day things that were so easy in your home country, where to go for, whatever I need for the house, or where to take the dog, or, random things that might be difficult to replace when you're in a foreign country. That sometimes is the biggest challenge, is just finding those day-to-day things to replace what you used to day in, day out.
Yeah, yes, totally. We both come from Anglo-Saxon countries. They operate differently to continental Europe. Portuguese operates on its own sort of schedule, amongst other things.
Yeah.
But so, there's a natural complication there. And of course, the language barrier,
Yeah.
of which, the barrier isn't strong. Everyone speaks English, but,
Yeah.
When you're dealing with authorities, it's much easier to speak the language. It's much easier to deal with them when you speak the language.
Yeah, I'm reasonably fluent in Portuguese, but
Wow.
like 2019, I got quite ill. Very, very ill, to the point where even just my normal motor functions weren't working well. And it was just a blessing that I could at least communicate in English to the doctor and just
Sure,
go, listen,
yeah.
this is what I'm feeling, this is what's going on, this is what's happened in the past. And for that, at least that still worked, and that's pretty cool about Portugal, is you'll always find someone who can communicate, can understand, will make a plan, which is
Completely.
nice.
Yeah, it makes life so much easier. I think that's one of the appeals about Portugal. Portugal, Germany, and the Netherlands have the highest concentration of English as a second language in Europe.
Yeah.
And whereas when you go to Spain, even in Madrid, Madrid is a beautiful city, But you'll find that even people in hospitality won't speak English, and nor should they. They don't have to.
Yeah.
But it just makes life so much easier here that everyone speaks English.
Yeah, it's come up a lot on the podcast because you obviously compare it to some of the other, continent, the other European countries, and there's two things. There's the capacity to speak English, and the willingness to speak English is
Totally.
sometimes lacking in some of those other countries, where Portugal, they have both. They are capable. Their level of meeting people that speak multiple languages is common in Portugal, which is incredible. But the willingness is there as well. Like they have no chip
Totally.
on their shoulder. They're happy to talk English if they need to help you.
Yes, totally agree. This is in France.
Yeah, it's not exactly. I didn't want to mention a name, but you went there.
No, look.
No, it's
Yeah,
true, but it's true.
yeah.
But Chris, how? I mean, you're from New Zealand. I'm from South Africa. We're going to put our rugby rivalries aside for the next 45, 50 minutes. Your wife's British. How did you guys end up here? How did that happen? Portugal.
Well, I met her here 2 years after I arrived, but
Okay, so she was already here.
no, I was already here.
Oh,
I mean,
you
she
were
came.
already
She
here.
was yes, and she was one of that big contingent of Brits that moved across during COVID. You know,
Okay.
uh, but the first time I came to this country, I came in 2012 when my girlfriend and we were on a trip through Middle East, and it
Okay.
was it was bizarre. It was a bizarre trip. I was in a dish dash. She was in a burqa. We had this very weird, interesting trip, and the whole point of this trip was that we were trying to get off the beaten track. And what's illustrative is that we started that trip in Portugal because at the time in 2012, Portugal was off the beaten track.
Yeah.
And so we arrived in Porto and blah blah, had a great time. And then I came back in 2016 when I was working for a company in the UK, and we were looking to set up an office here. And unfortunately, we didn't because you could have touched anything and it would have turned to gold back in 2016. But then I was in 2000. But I'd quit my job and I was traveling through Central Asia, through Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, the stands, and I was living there. And I was writing a
Well,
book about the history of the stands. And I was in Bishkek, which is the capital of Kyrgyzstan, which is, the nature is spectacular, but the city was built by the Soviets. And it was the middle of winter, and it was it was miserable. And I had a message, and I was very lonely. And I had a message from a friend who was in Lisbon. She said, "Look, can you get to Lisbon?" And I said, "Well," and there was actually a cheap flight from Bishkek to Istanbul to Lisbon. And God, I turned up to Lisbon, and it was the first week of October, and there was this sort of balmy, slightly autumn evening. It was beautiful, and we sat on these stairs, and we had a glass of wine, and there was candle lights flicking, and there were people. There was a guy on a guitar, and I just thought, my God, this city is, spectacular. And it was so I sort of, I sort of thought, right, how do I make this work? And that was kind of when it was.
amazing.
Hmm.
That was but that wasn't your first experience in Portugal. I mean, did you tell the guys when you came the first time, hey, we need to jump here, we need to get in here, and they didn't listen?
The decision was made in the UK, and we were looking at a number of different European cities, and Lisbon just seemed, Lisbon today versus Lisbon in 2016 are quite different cities. It's
Yeah.
a far more worldly city now, whereas it just didn't seem quite large enough at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, really unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Let's go let's go a bit more forward. You've been kind of wooed by Lisbon on this balmy October night with the guitar in the park and all
Yes,
of that.
yes, yes.
What's kept you here? Like, what have been these things that you appreciate about Portugal that's kept you here?
Um, Portugal. I mean, I arrived and that was in 2018, and I moved here in the start of 2019, and the country has
COVID. I mean, just before COVID.
2 years before, yeah, or a year and
Yeah,
a
yeah,
half.
yeah,
Um, and the country has just grown so much since then across the country. I mean, this entire country is covered in cranes from north to south. And, when I arrived, there were 450,000 foreigners living in the country, and today there are 1.5 million. And that energy obviously the money as well, and that's an important factor of it because Portugal was, and increasingly less, was a poor country. But there was just so much ideas, so much energy coming into this country. And I've listened to some of your guests, and there's a lot of cool stuff going on in this country, and that enthusiasm and that energy, that's definitely been a thing that has held me here. And of course, my wife and child, who's Portuguese, now stuck. But
Yeah, yeah.
but it's just the energy of the place, the growth of the country. This country is dynamic.
How old's Vasco?
14 months.
Okay, so still a baby.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you want to shed some light on this place for kids? In more accurately, babies. Uh,
Yes.
for me, just to give it a bit of a bit more meat to that is when I moved to Portugal back in 2009, I didn't have kids. I wanted to at some point start a family, and I couldn't think of. I did well. Let me put this. I didn't want to start a family in South Africa. Like there was just no way in hell.
Sure. Yeah, interesting.
And I look at the 16 years down the line. I look at the life my children have here, and it's the best decision I ever made was to give them this life. But from your perspective with a younger boy, you've named him a Portuguese name, which is so cool. Yeah, just shed some light on that Portugal for kids.
Yes, I mean that is a real factor in Portugal. You know, when my wife was pregnant, it was so interesting to see that if we were in a line, if we were, say, a supermarket or whatever, not only would they allow us to go to the front, they would insist upon it. And that sort of that and that, there is such a strong community vibe here, and there's such a strong love for children in this country. You really feel it. And it sort of couples with the safety. I mean, this whole country is so safe. And, there's so many Americans shifting here now, and there's sort of a commonality amongst one of the things that they come for is safety, and it feels safe to walk with your kids on the street. There are parks everywhere. Everything's designed with kids in mind. When you compare that to Paris, and I love Paris, whereas Paris is, all about drinking, smoking, eating, and it's got nothing to do with kids. And I love doing those three things, but yeah, you can kind of do all four.
Yeah,
But
yeah, you can do
yeah,
you can do Paris, but with a nanny vibe.
yes, very much with the 95. But I think also that nature is such a all-present element in this country. This endless coastline. You've got the mountains. You've got Sintra. You've got Monchique National Park in the south. There's so much to do, and it certainly suits us as a family.
Yeah, well, you're from New Zealand, which is
Mm.
I've not been there, but everything I've seen, read, it is so green, and
It
you've got
is,
so much nature. Yeah, it would be difficult for you then to go to somewhere with just like concrete jungle.
of course,
Um,
totally,
yeah,
yeah,
and the diversity here is like insane. North to south, how different it is in such a
in everything.
small country and everything. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, the interior, the Serra da Estrela, or then you go to the north and you go to Jerez. It's spectacular. It's spectacular.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and then all the things that come with Portugal. I mean, putting aside, it's the nature with Portugal. So you go there and you can sit at a tasca, you can have a very nice time, you can go with your friends. There's this joyousness.
yeah,
It's good. Everything's good.
yeah. It's really good. Um, Talk about you're busy. You're about to publish a book. Our first sort of interactions on LinkedIn, and that was how amazing Portugal's history is and how much there's not a lot of English literature besides, the obvious one, Barry Hatton and the first global village and these kind of things. Um, Tell us why the book and a bit more about that.
Sure. Yes. I mean, you're absolutely right that, there's such I mean, there must be thousands of books written about Paris in any one, hundreds a year, I'd imagine. And yet there are none written about Portugal. There's obviously the Barry Hatton's books, which are perfectly fine. And then there's Conquerors, which is, notably good. But there's very few written about Portugal. There's very few written about Portuguese history in English.
Yeah,
In researching for my book, I noticed there are many books written about Portugal in Portuguese, but none in
of
English.
course.
And it's crazy because, my book it's a travelogue, but it focuses on the history of the country. And the history of this country it's long, it's sensational, it's tragic, it's glorious, and it's a real history waiting to be told. It's such an obvious history to be told, and such an enjoyable history to be told. and there isn't anything on offer. It's crazy.
What did you narrow down? What did you narrow it down to? Because, like you said, it's long. Like there's
Yeah.
so many. There's the medieval stuff. There's the most recent, more recently, the dictatorship. In between that, you've got wars, you've got romance, you've got a royal family that got completely wiped out almost. And I've had a couple of people on the podcast for historic episodes, and
Oh
we've had to
wow.
just kind of narrow it down to, okay, these 10 years, because within that 10 years, it's so fascinating. But how were
Yeah.
you, how were you able to narrow it down?
Well, I didn't. I
Okay.
tried to cover. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, the purpose of my book is for someone will read the book and they'll have a general history from start to finish, and from
Okay.
start is in Neolithic, right up to Luis Montenegro. So I mean, you can walk away after finishing the book, and you'll have a complete understanding of where Portugal sits in the world. But yes, I mean, the history is fascinating. There was going right back to Neolithic. There was a huge Neolithic presence here, one of the largest across Europe. And if
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm sure you've been there. But the
Cromlech.
cromlech, exactly. This
Yeah.
is larger than the Stonehenge and 3,000 years older. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
It was originally built in 6,000 BC, and then 2,000 years later they decided to refurbish it. I mean, now it's 4,000. It's just mad the length of time. But then it went
Yeah.
into the Phoenicians, the Lusitanians, the Romans. The Romans had a long presence here. Then
Yeah.
obviously the North African Moors, um, obviously the Visigoths too, and then of course the Christians. And then so a lot of that would be true of a lot of Europe. But then the interesting point is the Moors were obviously a very unique element of Spain and Portugal. But then the main point is that the history of Portugal itself has been so contiguous. Portugal was at war with the Castilians over and over again before Castilians had conquered the rest of Spain. So the Portuguese history, Spanish history sort of kicks off around a unified Spain is 500 years old. A unified Portugal is almost 1,000 years old. So there's, amongst just in that 1,000 years, there is so much rich history and so much tragedy, which is, and that's the sort of the romanticism about the place. There's so much tragedy and so much glory, and there's so much that happens in such a small country. This is objectively a small country. It objectively has a tiny population, and yet it fired the starting gun for the age of exploration for Europe. It really chipped away at the world statue.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, do you think of how much of the world was discovered by this little country? It's insane. The
It
other
is
mir
insane.
the other miracle for me when I look at history is how we don't speak, how we're not part of Spain is
Well, we've almost become where we were.
phenomenal. Yeah,
I agree. Well, we almost, I mean, we were for 70
yeah, yeah,
years.
yeah,
But there have been many moments in history when we almost were, and that's been some of the defining moments of Portuguese history. These landmarks throughout its history have been fending off the
yeah.
Castilians, and
Algibraltar.
El Gibraltar, exactly. And
Yeah,
then it even extends to World War II when the Nazis and Franco were talking. And there was a moment there where Franco and Salazar, the two dictators of Spain and Portugal, as they did not like each other. And Spain had always kind of wanted Portugal, and the Nazis kind of offered it to them. They said, "Look, we will capture Portugal, and we can give you part of Portugal if you help us in this thing." And interestingly, the British were aware of this, and they had spies here during World War II, notably Ian Fleming, who was in Estoril Casino, and he was here for that. And the program that he was under was called GoldenEye, and the program of GoldenEye was
fun.
to have people behind enemy lines if that did take place, if Portugal got taken over by the Nazis or by the Axis powers. But that was, but and if they had done that, then we would be speaking Spanish probably.
Thank goodness. Yeah, thank
Mm.
goodness. What what's the name of the book?
The book's called Meet the Tugas,
Okay, so
and
Tugas is a very Portuguese
very
kind of
Portuguese.
slangy phrase. Tell us what Tugas is.
Yes, well, originally it was derogatory, and it was used in the 70s in the wars, the colonial wars that Portugal was fighting in Africa, and it was the opponents that would refer to these goddamn Tugas. but that's subsequently evolved into, it's meant to be the quintessential characteristic idiosyncratic Portuguese person is a Tuga. And so, and my book is meant to introduce the reader so that they can write, this is what a Tuga is, this is what Portugal is.
Yeah.
The problem with the name is that you recognize Tuga, I recognize Tuga, but my audience might not. So I need to market it correctly.
Yeah, it's because it's not a well-known term, and it's quite interesting that, and traditionally, historically, it was a kind of a derogatory name.
Yeah.
But now it's an affection thing. It's
totally affectionate.
There's pride to it as well.
Absolutely, there's pride to it. And my publisher is translating my book into Portuguese, and it's called Conhecer as Tugas. And when I tell...
That's going to sell. I'm telling you now. That's going to sell.
Yes, well, interestingly, my publisher said, look, do you want to just do this in Portuguese? And I said, no, I've written it for an English audience. And they said, the thing about Portuguese is that they love to know what foreigners think of them, which I think is probably true of every person, but this was the argument. But then I convinced them, no, we will do English and Portuguese. But my point is that when I speak to Portuguese people I know or friends, and I say, yes, it's called Conhecer as Tugas, they love it. Like, it's amazing. It's an amazing name.
You just said something really, really interesting, and maybe we can unpack a little bit, because one of the things that I noticed, having lived here for such a long time, I found the Portuguese, and this is going to lead to a question. The Portuguese, a lot of Portuguese I met along there, they didn't know and weren't aware of how cool their stuff is. Their country, their culture, and I always remember this at the festas. When you go to like one of those traditional town or village or neighborhood festas where it's just the good stuff, they've got a bit of live music, everybody's sitting together at tables. If there's 3 spaces available at your table, somebody joins in. There's food, there's wine, there's the gossip, there's everybody just being together until late at night. And I remember, colleagues of mine would be like, oh, you went to our festa in our village? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, did you like it? I'm like, Jesus, of course I liked it. What's there not to like? And it was almost like this surprise and almost like a bit of embarrassment, but our stuff's, old and lame. And you mentioned, you just said like Portuguese are always curious to know what foreigners think of them. Like, it's interesting. It's almost like there's this beautiful naivety of, they don't know how good they've got it and how beautiful parts of their culture are. What's your take?
Yeah, I agree. It is definitely interesting, and it's definitely real. I think that, Portugal, when it came out of the dictatorship, was the poorest country in Western Europe. And it's really only finding its feet in the last decade, 2 decades. And I think there's possibly an insecurity about that. But what's ignored by that is that that's allowed them to retain their authenticity. And that is the huge appeal about Portugal. It's authentic. It's certainly, capitalism has arrived late to this country. And because of that, it's not consumer driven. It's not flashy, And so you could imagine that these festas, which are raw, the whole thing about these festas, it's extraordinary how amateur some of them are. And that's the appeal about it. It's like, God, you can kind of just do anything. You can just smoke a cigarette, drink a beer. It's just so much fun. It is so much fun. Whereas the alternatives to that would be a lot of money spent on it. Everything's flashy. Can't touch that. Don't scratch that. Smoke over there. Drink over there. It's the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
So, I can understand if someone came over to your house and, you haven't got a very pretty house and you say, well, I hope you're having a good time. And you're like, I'm having a great time because of the authenticity of this party. It's great.
Yeah.
So yes, it's interesting. I noticed that too.
Yeah. Between my job as a realtor at Portugal Realty and hosting this podcast, life is pretty busy. But lately I've been receiving so many messages from people that want to know more about buying property here on Portugal's Silver Coast that I've got to do something about it. So starting now, for subscribers only, I'm offering up a 30-minute session per day. That's 5 30-minute sessions for a one-on-one meeting to talk about buying property here on Portugal's beautiful Silver Coast. This is for subscribers only. So please subscribe to book your session and get in touch with us through the links below via WhatsApp or email to book your session today. I'll be happy to speak to you. It's for subscribers only, and it's completely free. You mentioned the dictatorship, and it's the amount of times that I've interviewed people on the podcast who have brought this up, and how so much of what Portugal is about today is because of what they couldn't be back then. That freedom to be together. Like just
Totally
a simple
agree.
thing of I mean, it was literally, you couldn't talk to more than one person on a street corner because otherwise you were conspiring. And then it went from that to, well, now we can be together. Now we can celebrate together. Now we can be together on squares and at festas. But I'm interested from your doing this book, what other things, because it's so interesting. I mean, you're in commercial real estate, and I'm in real estate and construction. And a lot of times people say, well, why do they build the buildings like this, and why do they do the doors like this in Portugal? And I always say to people, anything to do with Portuguese construction can be traced back to historic events, the earthquake
Sure.
and the fire, and I look at certain aspects of Portuguese culture, and there's a historic reason for it. I mean, what are some of the little things that you've picked up in your research doing the book where you've gone, oh, that could explain why Portugal is the way it is today in some ways?
Of course, yeah, that is interesting. I can't think of exact small specific things. There is definitely a shadow that's been cast by the dictatorship. And you're right. He stifled Portuguese culture. We didn't stifle it. He actually celebrated Portuguese culture. His whole thing, Salazar's whole thing was the three Fs. It was Fatima, football, and Fado. And he wanted ultra Portugal. He loved Portugal. He just loved Portugal. And he wanted to celebrate it and wanted to maintain it. But he wanted to maintain it by avoiding any form of modernity. There's this quite famous anecdote. I wonder if it's true, but there's a famous anecdote where supposedly his minister had come to him and he was organizing water into a very rundown, poor Alentasian village. And the minister had said, right, we need to plug water, we need to plug this into the water supply, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, we can't do that because if we do that, the woman won't be able to collect at the well anymore and gossip. He had such an old-fashioned view. One, he had an old-fashioned view, but two, he had this view that you had to keep everything as is. You could not change anything.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about Salazar is that in his early days, he was celebrated. He brought order to chaos
Yeah.
when there was so much chaos after the king was assassinated. And then he very carefully and in a very fine line kept Portugal out of the war, and he did this extremely successfully. He had so much pressure on both sides from the Axis and the Allies. And of course, as we were talking about before, he almost got invaded during that period. But he managed to keep Portugal out of the war. And so post World War II, it's like, my gosh, this guy has, saved us. One of the few countries in the world that didn't have this extraordinary violence put on top of it. But he then stayed on. He then stayed on for another 26 years. And he kind of didn't leave. He fell over, knocked his head, and then ended up dying. He didn't even, it wasn't like he was overthrown. His government was overthrown 3 years later. But that 26 years in which he stayed on is when the rot set in, when people couldn't, women weren't allowed to leave the country without their husband's permission. Everything was so controlled and stifled. And, he left a country in 1974, when the revolution occurred, he left a country with one of the highest infant mortality rates, one of the lowest literacy rates. It's kind of a deindustrialized nation with corruption that was, rampant. And so, that was kind of his legacy. Whereas it didn't have to be that way, but that turned into his legacy. And I don't know he comes from a town called Santa Pombadao. I'm not saying that right. Santa Pombadao. It's this tiny village
Mm-hmm.
just north, west of Coimbra.
Okay.
And I visited, and outside this tiny village is even a much smaller cemetery, and it's where he's buried. And it's remarkable how unremarkable his grave is. His grave is a concrete slab next to other concrete slabs, and some concrete slabs are bigger. And there's an old sepia photo of him in a suit on it, but otherwise there's nothing. And so for someone to rule, he was the longest dictator in 20th century history. For someone to rule that long and to have no memorial, to have his gravesite completely unremarkable is illustrative of how people think of him,
Yeah.
and what his his lasting legacy is not a positive one.
Yeah, because my father-in-law, I mean, he passed a few years back, and he for him, his generation, is in his those guys in their 70s and 80s, they remember it
Oh,
like
sure.
very, very clearly. It wasn't that long ago, and he was always very kind of objective about it. He was like, yeah, he stayed longer than what he should have, but there were
No,
some
exactly.
things he did which we're still benefiting from today. The schools there's a school in every village. Now, some
Sure.
of them might not be there anymore or they'll be empty, but there was a school in every village. Like every little
Sure.
village you drive through in Portugal, there's a school building. Little
Mm.
things like that, which was super interesting. Um, are you
Yeah.
familiar with the guy who I can't remember the name. I had a previous guest on the podcast, a guy called Stephen Powell, and he's written a book which is interesting. It's called Walking Europe's Edge, and
No.
he's a Welshman, and he walked the north to the south of Portugal, and then after walking north to south, he decided that he wanted to live here. But he
Ah,
he goes through kind of different parts of the country, and he also digs in a little bit to the history. And he spoke about a guy. Now I can't think of the name, but he was a minister during the Salazar era, and he was granting visas
of
to.
course. Yes. To fleeing Jews out of, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's
It's
fun,
an extraordinary story.
amazing.
Yeah. It
Yeah,
is amazing. And it's tragic as well. I mean, he's kind of a Portuguese Schindler.
yeah,
I don't know the story about Schindler's List, but I recognize the
something. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
similarity. Yes. Yeah. It's tragic though, because he went against the orders of Salazar, and was
Frozen out,
uh, yeah,
basically.
frozen out. I mean, he lost his job. He was never allowed to work in the public service again. He was a diplomat. He'd achieved diplomatic status because he was obviously skilled. But he became ostracized. His family became ostracized. He died in poverty 15 years later, I think, from some sort of disease, maybe from stress-related disease. It was a very tragic end to someone that had saved the lives of thousands of fleeing Jewish refugees. I think in 2011, Israel recognized him. And I think there's a term that they gave that the Israeli government gives to people. It's called greatness among humanity or something. There's an expression where they bestow on people humanously
Yeah,
this title, and he was granted it because Israel recognized him for what the things that he had achieved.
it's incredible. I didn't know
Mm.
about this, and apparently there's a museum near Viseu where his
Ah,
old house is, and apparently it's amazing. But in your research, I mean, there's obviously the obvious historical places that people can always go visit. Your Blaine monastery, your Blaine Tower and your
sure.
Jeroen's monastery. But is there any something super interesting that you've discovered in your in your research and visited where you're like, this is where I would send somebody?
Yes, actually, there was. I mean, there's so many places, of course, but there was
Yeah,
one place. I don't even know if I could send people there because I was actually when I as part. It took me 4 years. And I traveled this entire country, and I went in granular detail. But I could only do it when I had free time, and thank God I did it prior to having a kid. But I
yeah.
was
You wouldn't have been
I
able
would
to
be
do it with a kid.
impossible. We would not be
Exactly.
sitting here right now, Dylan,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
I
exactly.
I'd had a kid earlier. But how I would do it is I would look at Google Maps, I'd plan my route, I'd try and fit in as much into this tiny 5-day itinerary. And I did this over the course of 5 years, 5-day itinerary, 5-day itinerary.
Wow.
And I saw on Google Maps, sort of near Beja in Alentejo, casted as something, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. And I clicked on it, and it was this extraordinary manor in the countryside. It's a beautiful manor. And it was privately owned. It's not publicly owned, but it was privately
Mhm.
owned. And it turned out to be the house or the once house of Vasco da Gama.
Okay.
I'd come across it trying to organize my itinerary on Google Maps, and it just popped up on Google Maps. I was looking from satellite view. So my God. And so I ended up calling the daughter of the owner, who's this old Portuguese man. And I went there and he brought me into his house and showed me around, and it's this extraordinary, extraordinary house. And then he told me the story. I mean, he said, Vasco da Gama was buried there. And then in 1898 or something around then, the bones were exhumed and taken to Geronimo's monastery where they are today. So you can go to Geronimo's monastery, you can see a big coffin where Vasco da Gama is buried. What this guy was saying, he said the bones were not his. He told me this extraordinary story. And the way he knew that, there were a number of people that over the centuries had been buried in this manner at in a chapel. And he said you could tell because because Vasco da Gama died in Goa, in India. Yeah. And he laid in Goa for 30 years before the Portuguese went and got his body and brought it back to Portugal. Okay. And over that time, his bones had been stained yellow by the soil, the Goan soil. And so the bones that were taken from this Vasco da Gama's house were not yellow. And so because of that, they're still there. And so, it was just extraordinary.
Okay. And so you're saying that Vasco da Gama is not in Geronimo's monastery. I'm
saying that right now. I know that goes against the conventional understanding, but this is the way he explained it. He made a very compelling case.
The guys from Geronimo's are going to shut us down. They're going to shut us down.
Yeah, exactly. My book will not be in Geronimo's. But the interesting thing was with this house this is not on any map. Well, I take that back. It's on Google Maps, but it's not on any historical tourist map. It was just I literally stumbled across it. No, there's nothing advertised at all. I just stumbled across Vasco da Gama's house. There's so much of this history just everywhere in this country, everywhere, and it's not marked on maps. This country.
Have you been to Aljubarrota?
Yeah, of course.
It's so disappointing. It is so disappointing. Because I'm like, this is where, if we had not won that battle,
yes,
it's one of many. But if we had not won that battle, we are Spain. Like that was
one Spain. Of the key, that's
correct. I'm amazed that they've never made a Hollywood movie about that battle because it was us and the Brits. The British against the Portuguese, against the Spanish and the French. Mm-hmm. And we were completely outnumbered. And it was just because of a really strategic battle that we were able to win that. And you go to the battle site and, man, it's not well explained.
I haven't been to the battle site. That's so interesting. Yes, it's on the way there, right? On the motorway. You turn right.
Man, it's literally behind some houses. Then there's like a bit of open land, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's the battle site there. And then they've got this interpretation center. And I was just like, but I was so disappointed with it, man. I was just like, should be something monumental. Wow,
Yes.
The place that did impress me was Conimbriga. I don't know if you've been to Conimbriga.
I have. The Roman ruins, you mean?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Very beautiful. Very beautiful.
Really, really interesting. So, for people that don't know who's listening, it's a big kind of Roman settlement that they just kind of abandoned. It's a mystery why they left. Apparently it was an illness or a plague or something, but I'm not sure if you know more about why they left the settlement.
There were Roman villas. There are Roman settlements and Roman villas. That's one of the greatest ones. Yeah, but they're everywhere. But that is a very big one. And the beauty about that one is the mosaics and the columns. There's that atrium with the mosaic, very beautiful mosaics. In the Algarve, you see a lot of these types of things as well. And often they were large farms, where the workers, it would be a very wealthy family with a big manor, and then there'd be worker houses around that. But I suspect, Rome pulled out of Europe essentially. It collapsed. The whole empire collapsed, and I think they abandoned a lot of this. There's actually, the small mountain village Monsanto.
Oh yes.
Yes, of course. Very beautiful mountain village. Built into the rocks, part of the rocks. But there's a town. No, it's not even a town. 50 people must live in this village, but it's called, I don't know who.
Idania Nova.
Yes. How do you know? Yes, that's right. This is very obscure knowledge. That's great knowledge for it. But there's the Roman ruins in that were then refashioned by the Knights Templars. No, I'm sorry. It was the Roman ruins refashioned by Visigoths, then refashioned by the Knights Templars. It's just extraordinary. There's so much history built upon history.
Yeah, and now history. Yeah, and now that area is well known because of the Boom Festival.
Exactly. Yes, that's right.
And you're just like, man, look. No, I wasn't there because of Boom. It's not my thing at all. No, I wanted to go see Monsanto, that castle. We've had
Ah, the castle, of course. The castle is beautiful. Yeah.
on Monsanto, we had a lady on the podcast who was responsible because they filmed House of Dragons there, and
Yes, I heard that.
she
Yes.
organized all of that, and it's interesting because if you go there, for them to get the camera crew, all the gear in there, it's almost impossible because it's these narrow roads that go up, and they had to do it all by a military helicopter. So it's just like really, really interesting. But yeah, the whole country is just those cromlechs that you mentioned near to Evora. I mean, wow, just
Totally well.
you just
And
go
discovered in
stand there and
1961. Discovered in 1961.
yeah, yeah. And we had the one of the archaeologists from there, Sita
Wow.
Camacho. Yeah, she was on
Wow.
the podcast, and just like how they got these rocks there. It was a trading place where they used to barter, where different nationalities were there from all parts of the world, and then there was the spiritual element with the stars, and it's just mind blowing. Yeah,
Yes, that is mind blowing. That is mind blowing. And then abandoned.
and then abandoned. Just everyone just
Yes.
left.
Mm.
And then you got
Yes.
those dolmers, I think they're called, who they're like,
Yes,
those
that's
mini
right. All
graves,
across
which are,
Alentejo.
yeah, we're just driving randomly through the cork trees, and there's one, and there's one, and you're just like, this is where they buried people. And yeah, it's incredible.
And as no doubt but that they would have once upon a time been covered in dirt, be covered in grass. So it would have been a cave on the surface of the earth in which you would have gone down into it, and the generations of family would have been buried there. Whereas now
Right.
all the dirt is obviously eroded away, so we just see the rocks. But if you go to some of those interpretation centers across Alentejo and you see where those Dolomites were, it was very much an Iberian thing, and it was very much a Portuguese thing. It doesn't extend all the way back to Europe. There was a civilization across these two countries, Spain and Portugal, that were very unique to this area.
They were the only ones that did it. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
Well, but we say that, but then, there's a similarity with the Stonehenge, of course. And, the Celts were here and they had a big presence. And you can see it. There's the mountain range from Sintra that extends into Serra da Estrela and then goes into Spain. And the Celts were north of that, and they were kind of less south of that. And you see it today. I mean, Galicia in Spain, their national instrument is the bagpipe. But when you're in Porto, you see poor people walking around with red hair. The naturally red-headed Portuguese, where there'll be no redheads in the Algarve. It's this
Yeah,
distinctive. There's a Celtic influence in this country, and it's in the north.
yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, so you did this exploration over 5 years
4 years,
of
yeah.
4 years of Portugal. Now you obviously learned a lot about the history. What did you learn about the country and the people doing this? What was your experience there?
Uh, I mean, a lot is the short answer. I
Give
think
us a
I'll
few
give us a
things that
few.
you, yeah,
Yeah. I think, one of the things that really struck me was the difference in the regions. This is I come from New Zealand. The country is 200 years old. There is a slight difference between North Island and South Island. It's more of a rugby thing. Whereas in Portugal, this country is almost 1,000 years old, and it's allowed different regions to be very different types of people. I mean, the people in the north of Portugal are vastly different to the people that live in the Algarve. They look different. And then the Azorians are kind of stoic and laconic, whereas the Madeirans are kind of fiery and there's different. They're different people, and it's interesting that obviously they're all Portuguese, but there's a whole different mentality and there's a whole different style of living, and I
yeah,
think that's what's interesting. I love knowing that information because when I meet Portuguese, I say, right, where are you from? And they'll say somewhere random, and I'll say, I've been there, which I love saying. I'll make it up sometimes. But then, but if I can, but
yeah,
if they say they're from the north, I'll get into this huge conversation. And it's people in Lisbon, for instance, have no concept of the north. They love Alentejo. They love Alentejo. Whereas
yeah,
people in Porto, for instance, love Jerez, and they never really come down south. I mean, it's almost two different countries. And it's great knowing that, and it's great having these
yeah,
discussions with
yeah,
Portuguese because they all believe it.
yeah. What's super interesting, and this is where I mean, the comparisons between Portugal and Spain are endless. But this is where it's quite interesting for me is there's such a difference in the regions in
Mhm.
Portugal. Anybody from those regions, they're convinced that their bread from their region is the best one. Their way of doing bacalhau is the best way, and there's this
Yes.
pride. But there's not regionalism like you've got in Spain, where you've got very clear provincial divides where some of them want to become autocratic and independent. Portugal's still Portugal, but we have pride in our little patch, and that's something quite beautiful as well.
Totally. And that stems back to the history. Spain is really a set of countries conquered by the Castilians, whereas Portugal is Portuguese.
Yeah.
The Basques are different to the Castilians, the Catalonians are different to the Castilians. And you could imagine in some sort of future where Spain broke apart, where Portugal would never break apart.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
interesting.
Mm.
Have you been to Madeira?
Yeah, yeah, a few times, yeah.
Have you been to the valley with the really short people? Nuns Valley.
No, I haven't
Well,
actually.
so it's this valley that's like I don't want to get the meters wrong because it's this valley that's deep, deep, deep down into the island, and you've got to drive down like 10, 15 minutes to get into the village, and everybody there is like short, like really, really short. And it's called Waldfredes or Nuns, in translated Nuns Valley, and it's it's weirdly fascinating. Like,
That is fascinating.
yeah, yeah,
Who know, I
it's
might have gone there. I didn't even see them. I might have looked
possibly,
above them,
you might not hear to talk there. Yeah, yeah,
walked past them. But
yeah.
that's it. That is interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
no,
Madeira is interesting. Madeira and the Azores, they were discovered by the Portuguese, obviously. So they've only ever been occupied by the Portuguese. And in my history, in my research, I came across this source of a priest that had been writing in the 16th century, and he was in I can't remember which island, maybe Fayal. And he'd said when the Portuguese had discovered Tessara Island, there was actually someone on there. But he sort of alluded to it. There was just some sort of shipwrecked person on there. But otherwise, besides this one guy that was just shipwrecked and by himself in the middle of the Atlantic on this tiny island,
well,
these countries, they were,
there's also historic evidence that there was a Belgian colony in the Azores,
wow,
which
okay.
is interesting.
That is interesting.
And obviously not public, not big, not everybody knows because obviously it's a Portuguese island, but apparently there was this Belgian colony there as well. So yeah, it's just how interesting, how diverse, how this country was so influenced by, you talk about the Moors, you talk about, the Algarve with the Arab influence, the Celts. You see it in some of our crosses, some of the historic crosses that we've got on random hilltops. There's a very distinct Celtic element to the
Interesting.
architecture, so it's
Interesting. Well, have you
rolling
been
hills.
to Miranda de Douro?
Yes, yes,
Exactly. They speak an
yeah,
entirely different language. It's
yeah,
actually a language recognized by Portugal, but that language extends back to pre-Roman. It's not a Latin-based language, and it
Melendez,
goes
yeah.
back to something like 600 BC. And they believe that I think the general understanding is that they're Celtic of origin, of Celtic origin. And to your point about everyone thinking that they've got the best X, they claim to have the best steaks.
Melendeza, yeah, pasta Melendeza,
Exactly.
and it's good.
Yes.
It's really good.
Is it the best though?
No, I can't, I
Oh,
can't, I can't, I
man.
can't say it's the best. But it's damn good. Yeah, it's
Yes.
really good. I don't know if I could say it's the best. I'd have to really think about that. But have you seen the dances that those guys do? The
I
traditional
have.
with the
I have.
sticks. It's
I have.
insane.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So for
It
people who
is
haven't seen it,
insane.
check out the Mirandez dance. They do this thing with these big, like, they're not sticks.
Nunchucks.
They're
Yeah.
nunchucks. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they hit sticks in between
Mm.
their hands. They get blisters, they get splinters, the sticks
Mm.
break, they bleed. It's really interesting. It's good. It's
It
really
is
good.
interesting. That town is a population of, I don't know, 3,000 people. And yet
Yeah.
they've got this strangely concentrated culture that extends back
And still
two and a half
today
thousand years.
they're proud of the fact that they're Mirandés
Yeah, very much so.
and that they have this dance and they have this meat, and
Mm.
it's awesome. It's right there on the border.
Mm.
Yeah,
Right on the border, on the Douro.
you could miss it if you didn't know it was there.
Very easily.
Yeah, yeah.
Very.
We could talk about this for ages, Chris, but Where, yeah, this is going to be a bit of a left field question, but you've traveled all over the place. You and your wife are both from different places. You've settled here in Portugal. It's what's been now 7 years.
Almost 7, yeah.
Yeah. How has Portugal changed you?
Um, Good question. Well, I wore a suit my entire life, and I haven't worn a suit for 6 years. I think that's probably, I haven't worn a tie for 6 years now. I think that's a big change. I don't, you see, it's very rare to see people wearing ties. Um, I,
Just the
I
bankers.
suppose, no, I suppose one of the things is it's actually made me more extroverted because people here are, there's so much joy on the streets. There is nothing you couldn't call, in some places of Portugal you could, but you wouldn't generally say Portugal is stiff. And it's certainly not stiff in the streets where people are having fun and are happy. And because everyone's so happy here, it makes you happy yourself and it makes you go out, it makes you extroverted. So, I would say that's probably that. Maybe that's what
Amazing.
it has done for me. It's made me more extroverted. Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm.
As a lover of history, this doesn't have to necessarily be a historic thing, or it can be a cultural thing, a way of life. What's a part of Portugal that you would love that never goes away, that we can preserve and keep forever?
Um, Probably it's authenticity. It's authentic. It's authentic to be Portuguese is Portuguese. There's nothing, there's not really much consumerism in this country. Nothing's very contrived. Everything's real. The food is so unprocessed. And I think, it would be a shame now that Portugal is obviously becoming more of a player, and there's more money coming into the country. It would be a real shame if it lost its authenticity.
Yeah, I agree. What's one thing that you would like people to remember and take away from our conversation?
Oh, that they must buy my book. My life depends on it.
Okay,
Can I say that?
so yeah, you can. And because your life depends on it, how can people follow you? How can people find you online? How can people get their hands on the book?
I don't really have an on. Well, they can follow. I'm about to start my book. My book is released on the 25th of June in bookstores across the country, called Meet the Tugas. And in the lead up to that, I'm going to be doing posts on my social media about starting from the Neolithic on all the way up to the modern age, little snippets of the history and snippets of my writing. And so to see that, they can follow me on Instagram at my name, which is Christo, Chrissto Jones, Jones.
Awesome. I'm just looking at this. This is going to be, this is dropping on the 23rd of June. So 3 days from now.
Oh, I see. Yes.
So 3 days from now, people, 2 days from now, start looking for the book.
I hope so. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to get it. I'm going to get it.
I'll send you a copy, Dylan. Don't you worry.
Awesome. Chris, a question that we ask all of our guests: Portugal, the simple life. Why?
Well, it's not always simple. It can be quite complicated when dealing with the government. But I think the thing that I probably repeated myself quite a few times here, but it's the authenticity of the place.
Yeah.
The place it's not contrived. The food is unprocessed. The nature is at your doorstep. Life is easy. Life is happy. And that's what attracted me and that's what's kept me here.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's been a
pleasure,
very,
Dylan.
very interesting conversation.
Pleasure to meet you.
You're welcome. And I'm going to let you call it. This is where you say, that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
So thank you once again to our guests, and thank you to all of you for listening. Please subscribe, share with your friends, give us a thumbs up, and please leave a comment or a review. We always love to hear from you. Don't forget, Portugal The Simple Life also has a magazine, so download it. It's for free. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. And as we say in Portugal, sejas bem-vindo. Welcome to The Simple Life.